Hey, bonjour. Ça va bien?
Come on in.
How are you doing?
Good, you?
I'm very good. Nice to meet you, Assisi.
Okay.
I love it. This is awesome. Woo! Took a while to get here. Nice, great, awesome.
So, is it a long ride from Cyclone?
A little bit.
Shooting it raw?
Yes. Shooting it raw. Is that number 2?
That's number 2.
Awesome. So the next photograph is very different in feeling. It's a photograph of you in a sound studio. You've got large earphones over your head. There's a mic coming down from the top. You're reading off there's like a sheet music note for that musicians use to hold up the sheet music. You're in a studio of some sort. You're recording. You're wearing a kind of a cream-colored jacket because the aircon's probably on really too strong. And what makes a photograph so endearing is that your nose is partially wrinkled, but you're sticking your tongue out. It's a sweet photo, and it's called "Searching for My Voice." Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this was me recording a story of Hong Kong stories for a program on RTHK.
Oh, okay.
Right. So
the radio in Hong Kong.
Yes. So for all of you who have already heard Rachel Smith's episode, so she's the mistress and magician
Host,
behind
yeah.
Hong Kong Stories. So I've been part of Hong Kong Stories since 2017, and it's been huge part of my journey here in Hong Kong. So I joined actually 3 days after landing in Hong Kong.
Oh, wow.
I was searching for groups,
On a mission.
etc. Yes, making friends, but also because I was on sabbatical, right? And
Right.
I was already thinking, what am I going to do with this free time? And storytelling was already something that was compelling to me before I came to Hong Kong. So I immediately signed up, and it's been an amazing experience.
For sure.
Yeah. So I've been coached by other storytellers for 4 stories, I'd say. And then after I started feeling comfortable enough to become a host myself.
Nice.
And being a host actually has been extremely fun, extremely rewarding. To help other people find their voice, I think, is what I saw my role as a coach.
Yeah.
But in this picture, it was me at the very beginnings, right?
Right.
So I was still in search of my own voice.
Yeah.
But it was after going to that museum where I decided, okay, so I do want to go explore this area, storytelling, family history, but I didn't know what kind of angle. And I guess you as a writer would understand that, it takes time, I find, to know what you actually want to write about.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
And what's great with Hong Kong Stories is you get basically immediate feedback.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's oral storytelling, so you're raw in the moment.
Yeah.
And then you have the response, the immediate response from an audience.
Yeah.
But you have your own response to yourself, right? Do I feel good telling this story?
Right.
Right? Does it open up things that you want to explore more?
Yeah.
And so in this photo, I was recording the story of me going back to Vietnam for the first time. And it did touch upon a bit of my grandfather's story and what happened to him after the Vietnam War. So in 1975, South Vietnam lost the war against the North, and so the whole country became communist.
Yeah.
And my family was from the South. My grandfather at the time was the director of a hospital, and after a year, then he was in prison.
Yeah.
And actually, the family didn't know where he was for a year,
Wow.
right? And
Okay.
it's only a year after he was released, etc. Then they did all of these. They managed to flee. Basically,
Yeah.
I won't go into details, but that's a very brief summary of what happened after 1975.
Wow. Okay.
And so I touched upon that era of post 1975 in this story. And in the next story, which is called Dark Waters, that one I touch upon the refugee experience.
Sure.
So my mother as among the boat people.
Right.
And I found that I actually don't want to explore the refugee anymore.
Okay.
Right? Even though that first picture was all refugees staring up at me and saying, what are you going to do now?
Yeah.
I figured that, no, the refugee narrative is one that we have heard of a lot already, the Vietnamese refugees. So in that story, Dark Waters, it's about me acting for a video clip about that part of history, right? The boat people and how they were welcomed into Canada.
Right.
So I felt like the script has already been written there.
Okay.
But what we don't hear about as much is why they left.
Right. Okay.
Right? I remember, growing up and talking to people about, yes, my parents were refugees, and people would say, oh, it's terrible, wasn't it, the war? It's like, no, wait a minute. It wasn't the war. They didn't leave during the war.
Right.
They left after the war, once they lost the war.
Right.
Right, and the conditions of life became so difficult after the war that's when they left.
Yeah.
Right, and so I think I slowly found that this was what I wanted to explore more, even though it was more challenging.
Yeah.
But it was, I think, more meaningful for me at the time.
Sure.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know what else.
No, it's great. No, it's absolutely fantastic.
But I mean, storytelling, I think, beyond writing, I think I don't love writing. Like, to be frank with you, I don't love it. Like, the sitting and the finding the right word it's a lot of work. I don't mind work, but I'm much more of a storyteller.
Okay.
I have much more fun when I'm thinking about the character's psychology, the cause and effects in the story, and how desires and needs lead to certain actions and then leads to consequences and leads to change. That kind of thinking is something that I enjoy much more. So yeah, I think Hong Kong Stories was perfect for me.
Yeah.
Exploring the oral storytelling. But of course, for this story, I thought about it a lot. Is writing the right medium, or should it be theater? But in the end, I went for writing because I think it serves the story better.
Sure. And there's also something about writing that, in a way, it becomes quite, in some ways it's a bad thing because it becomes final, it becomes so anchored. And then in another way, it becomes like your best effort to capture your thinking. So as it happens, I'd mentioned that, my wife and I were in the tsunami in 2004. And I actually just reread what I had written a couple of days ago. So 2 days ago, I sat down and I thought, I'm going to reread what I wrote. And so what I wrote was captured at about 2004, 2005. It was actually soon after. And in my mind, I really wanted to capture my thoughts and interpretations and all this stuff. And that's what I wrote. And here we are, like so many years later. And kind of that really captured, as best as I could, the thinking at the time. It's true that in telling the story, you make it more alive with another person in front of you, and then you have the human connection. But so, for example, turning your story into theater, at some point you kind of have to. It's good to have a kind of a source, that you can turn back to and say, okay, that's, for better for worse, my final word on it. Okay, well, do you want to go? You want to continue?
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to take my notebook out for something.
Absolutely.
Is that okay?
No, of course. We'll just keep it all cut and paste. Yeah,
all right.
For sure. Is it because you're going to read to me?
It can serve at some point.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how nervous are you?
Kind of.
Your energy. Really? But it's just me.
It's just because I think I spend a lot of time alone. Right? Like with kids or alone, right? I feel like a conversation with an adult about adult subject matter. Like, adult subject matter I deal with, but in my head.
But
then actually expressing it, finding words in live. That's
high five me on that one. Awesome. No, it's good. It's good. It's good. But it's also the podcast is pretty intense because we go into these, like, in a way, what is the most intense territory for you? And let's dive into that, right? So the previous podcast was clearly that for the previous guest. Like, what's really important to you? Let's dive into it. And right now, where is your head at? What are you thinking about? Let's dive into it and in a way articulate and shape what you're thinking about. So that may not have been a question.
So you just want me to talk about something that's
important
to me?
But that's what the podcast is, kind of what we're doing, is we're just diving into the world of ideas and experience and, like, what's important to you. Like, how do you make sense of the world, really?
Sure. Well, since we're talking about storytelling, might as well, I will read to you what I wrote down here the other day. I quoted, do you know LeVar Burton?
Uh-huh.
Yeah? Okay, so I listened to something that he was saying, and he said, the job of a storyteller is that of a truth teller. You got to bring the truth. You got to be willing to stand in your truth and express it. Because if you don't, it just gives people permission to forget, to ignore, to obfuscate, and to change the narrative. So I think that's what I've been working on quite a bit with my story is narrative, this idea of narrative, and that there are some narratives that have been given more space than others. So in this situation, it's, the Vietnam War was very long. And then in the end, it was tragic for everyone involved. But you'll have a winner and a loser, right? And you have, so the winners here was the Communist North. And so their narrative gets told, right? It has more power to be spread and to reach out to people. And then you have the American narrative because they're a very powerful country.
Yeah.
But what happens to the narrative of the South Vietnamese, those who lost the war, like the Americans, who were the allies of the Americans, and who had to continue in that country living with the consequences of losing the war, and then going through that huge transformation as losers of the war, but then under a totalitarian form of government. Right. So that's where I'm coming from. Like, this is the narrative that I want to put out there. And not in a didactic way, but through going through what it was as an experience. So what the characters lived through. And I get inspired by what my family went through.
Of course you would, yeah.
And so that's one theme, storytelling. And the other theme of my writing is intergenerational trauma.
Okay.
Right? Because I am the generation that didn't live through that.
Yeah.
But I have absorbed so much of the stories that it then becomes part of my identity as well. And what's that experience like?
Right. Being audio, people can't see your face. I can see it on your face. This is, of course, extremely meaningful for you, and it's extremely profound, but also, the source of this, like, intergenerational trauma. Now, I come from a family that is also quite real, right? Like, my parents were kicked out of North Africa, out of Morocco, went to Israel, fought in the various wars in Israel, moved to Canada, and like, the Jewish people have this idea of intergenerational trauma baked into the cultures, a lot of the core mythologies, So when you speak, I can connect to that from my side, being in Montreal on the South Shore, and the small family and the storytelling, and it's interesting that I think you're like a spirit sister who went off in one direction but went to law, which is a very precise way of cutting of selecting, cutting, organizing ideas. So how would you say your legal training influences how you approach storytelling?
Well, I think I can take time to think, right?
Absolutely. No, because here's what's really interesting. I shoot before I aim, which shows that I'm more of a crazy poet. You aim before you shoot, which to me says you're a clearly a legal mind in a way. It's a compliment. But yeah, take time. Think about it. You're not being interrogated, by the way.
Well, I think for the first thing I'd say of my influence of the legal background is, I guess we can come to method later, but first of all is the content. So one of my classes during my legal training with truth, reconciliation, and Aboriginal perspectives.
Oh, wow.
And that was such an eye-opening class to me. And I remember crying in that class, right? Because I had never heard about residential schools before.
Right.
Never.
Right.
And it took me until the age of, 23 to learn about it. And it just made my jaw drop that I had been missing out on this whole different narrative of Canadian history for my whole life.
Yeah.
Right? And it's a very painful history, and it's a history that hadn't been dealt with on a large scale so that we can all process it together as a country, as communities. And so that was like so eye-opening for me. But then it made me, like, there's a back voice saying, hey, wait a minute, truth, reconciliation. I mean, it's great that we were able to have that commission and that national dialogue. Of course, we can debate about how much work still needs to be done, and the answer is huge.
Sure.
But at least there was that discussion.
Yeah.
Whereas my family never got that discussion
Right.
about what they went through and the pain that they went through,
Yeah.
right? Because it was a civil war. One side won. The side that won imposed a certain narrative, and everyone had to accept it, or else there were very difficult consequences, right?
Sure.
To the threat of your life. So it's harder to heal and process when you haven't had the chance for your truth and your narrative to be heard, and two, that connection with quote unquote the other side, so that the healing process can be initiated and then walked along together, right?
Yeah.
And so that started to make me think, well, then okay, so for my family, what's the alternative? What's the option for them? So that's another big theme of my writing, is about healing and reconciliation. Because I don't think we can expect until, it will take a lot of time before a reconciliation commission is put up for the Vietnamese experience. So what do we do to heal? What do we do to move on? Because it's, maybe this is from a Buddhist perspective, but in order to be peaceful inside, you need to let go, right? But how do you let go when your story isn't heard? Right? So you have to cling on to your story. You have to tell it again and again so that part of your identity can still be validated, right? Can still have meaning. Your suffering, the pain that you went through, can still have meaning because there's this story, there's this whole backdrop. If we forget it, if I let go, then how, how can I still give meaning? How will future generations still give meaning? But then if you don't let go, then you can't heal. It's harder to find peace inside.
Right.
So that's the first, I think, springboard for me from my legal studies, is that class. That class that just really got to me and made me think about my own personal history.
Right. Okay. Processing. Thank you.
Processing. So that's in terms of content. Now, I think part of what you're asking for is in terms of method, right?
Or practice.
Or practice. Well, I think as a lawyer, you're very conscious that there are different narratives, right? When you're defending a client, you're putting forth the narrative that's going to serve them most.
So did you work as a lawyer?
I did.
Okay. So you because it's one thing to go to school and to learn principles and theoretical and all this stuff, and it's another thing to actually go out and do the work.
Right.
And so.
So yes. I didn't work as a litigator, but I did train in a law firm in the litigation department. And I remember, you were given all of these facts, and then I loved it. I love that part where you narrate the facts, right? These are the facts. Now I'm going to put them into specific paragraphs to lead whoever who is reading, like the judge, etc., through what is happening. Right? And you will normally do it in a way that is going to serve what you want to say about the rights of your clients, right? Yeah. But I think you're also very conscious that you can probably say it differently, and it would be serving the other party, right?
Yeah, like you end up directing the attention. Well, the attention you sort of directing the bias of what conclusion you want the person to get to at the end.
And so I think I was very conscious of the variety of narratives, and that storytelling can be used for an end. Now the question is, what end? Right? And so in the case of lawyering, it is to the end of defending the rights of the person who is asking you to defend their rights. But now if you bring that to other levels, like let's say if we talk about collective storytelling, right? To what end? Right? If now we tell a story that obfuscates something, why do you obfuscate it? Right? And it has consequences. It has consequences on the kind of community that we build, on the kind of dynamics that we have within that community. So to go back to my shock in the class of Truth, Reconciliation, and Aboriginal Perspectives is, why has a whole lot of perspective been obfuscated from my education when I grew up?
Right? Your experience,
right? So to what end? Was it to build a national narrative that would go a certain way, that would be positive? The Canadian whatever, that Canada is nice, Canada is or something, but then we don't talk about what was tragic, right? So that, that goes back again to storytelling and its power on both ends. So it's power to help heal if you have the intention to use storytelling to heal and to bring people together. But storytelling can also divide, and storytelling can hurt, and storytelling can erase.
Yes. Woo. Shall we move on to the next photo as well?
Yes, we can.
Okay. No, this is great because it's also just a sense to keep the conversation moving, but each sort of photograph opens a window into your world, and it clearly communicates, what's important to you and how you see the world, which hopefully will inspire somebody else.
I'm all in.
So is life really a gift? Really? Can you make every second count? That's the whole point of the podcast. So if you like what you've seen and you're inspired, because that really is my mission, then please give it a like, subscribe, and share.
Shooting it raw?
Yes. Shooting it raw.